The Public Safety Committee will now come to order. Madam Clerk, will you please call the roll?
Alderman Odenberg.
Present.
Alderwoman Clark Hubbard. Alderwoman Keys.
Here.
Alderwoman Velazquez.
Present.
Alderwoman Sanye.
Present.
Alderman Aldridge.
Present.
Chair Narayan.
Here.
Alderwoman Clark Hubbard. We have 6 present. You have a quorum.
All right, at this point, I will entertain a motion to approve the minutes of Thursday, May 18th, 2023.
So moved.
Second.
All right, it's been moved and seconded. Madam Clerk, could you please call the roll?
Alderman Odenberg.
Aye.
Alderwoman Clark Hubbard. Alderwoman Keys.
Aye.
Alderwoman Velazquez.
Aye.
Alderwoman Sanye.
Aye.
Alderman Aldridge.
Aye.
Chair Narayan.
Aye.
Alderwoman Clark Hubbard. We have 6 aye votes.
All right, thank you. We have approved the minutes. At this point, we will take up Board Bill number 29. Per request of the sponsor, we won't be holding a vote today. This is just a kind of an introductory view of the legislation, and please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the Public Safety Committee. I have a couple of handouts that might be helpful as we talk about this. I'll hand those out, and then I'll kind of give us where we're at. Thanks, Tracy. So there's 3. Actually, I'll leave one of each. Thank you, members of the Public Safety Committee. So as the chair pointed out, I'm not asking for a vote today. What I want to do simply is to walk us through the bill, its legal components, and kind of how this would function. And then I'd like to open up for some discussions, some thoughts. I'd like to hear from you all, and then kind of develop a path forward. So I'll start by saying Board Bill 29 is a local ordinance pertaining to guns. I think we've all at some point said once, twice, 100 times that there are far too many guns on our streets. We've pointed our fingers, rightfully so, at the state legislature for disabling cities, specifically the city of St. Louis, from doing anything about guns. This has been the battle cry for our state, for our city, for the Board of Aldermen, for as long as I've been down here. And we're right to do that because the state of Missouri has tied our hands in many, many, many ways. But they have given us one pathway to address guns, and I'm going to walk us through that right now. I'll start out by saying, going back in time, the open carrying of firearms was not legal in St. Louis. It also wasn't legal in Kansas City. We had a local ordinance that went into effect in 1970. In 2014, the state of Missouri passed what we've all come to recognize or refer to as the preemption law, and that you have that before you right now. It's 21-750. This is the state law that went into effect in 2014 and really preempted, it even has it in its name here, firearms legislation preemption by the General Assembly with exceptions. And I'll point you to the section that I've highlighted here. The exception, and this is where it outlines what cities and jurisdictions within the state of Missouri can do. Section 2 reads, in any jurisdiction in which the open carrying of firearms is prohibited by ordinance, the open carrying of firearms shall not be prohibited in accordance with the following. And then it goes to outline persons with a concealed carry endorsement permit, and that they shall display that upon request. So really what it says here, it's counterintuitive because what we're talking about, what Board Bill 29 does is essentially walk through this pathway that the state of Missouri, the state law carves out for cities, jurisdictions, to restrict specifically the open carrying of firearms for those who do not carry and are willing to display a concealed carry permit. Okay, so to give a little more context here, as I mentioned, the open carrying of firearms was not legal in the city of St. Louis by ordinance going back to 1970. When this state law took effect, our local ordinance was thrown out because it did not comply with this state law. Kansas City had the same problem at that same time, but following the passage of this preemption law, Kansas City put in place a local ordinance that walked through this path and restricted the open carrying of firearms in Kansas City. If you ask people in Kansas City, they don't have to enforce this law because the open carrying of firearms never became legal and never became commonplace, and you don't see people walking down the streets of Kansas City with semi-automatic weapons. Unfortunately, here in St. Louis, that didn't happen. We didn't walk through this path. We didn't restrict the open carrying of firearms through the one pathway the state of Missouri gave us at that time. And we have seen over the last 8-9 years that it has become commonplace. It has become very widely known and well known that a police officer can do nothing about the open carrying of firearms, that no one can do anything about the open carrying of firearms in the city of St. Louis, and therefore there is a proliferation of guns throughout every community in the city of St. Louis. I know myself, I have seen people carrying semi-automatic weapons in my neighborhood. I've seen them in front of my house. My own children, my own son, my one child, has seen them unloaded in the streets in front of our house in broad daylight. It is absolutely terrifying to call 911 at the request of your son who's home alone and to have the answer at the end of the line say, we cannot do anything about that. It's terrifying. We know that carrying firearms often ends deadly. That's just fact. But the difference between carrying a firearm in your pocket or your backpack and the carrying of a firearm in your hand is vastly different. And that is shown time and time again with study after study after study. What this does is address the open carrying of firearms. It does not touch the concealed carrying of firearms. The state of Missouri will not let any jurisdiction touch that. So anybody and everybody that can currently carry a weapon in a concealed manner will be able to do so. What this does is address the open carrying of firearms within the city of St. Louis and nothing more. In introducing this and finding this one pathway, I recognize that it's not as easy as it sounds to just start banning guns from our streets after so many years of it becoming commonplace and legal. And a very volatile scenarios can unfold when you have, especially young people for whom their emotional state, their emotional being is still in development, to take away the right to carry a firearm in an open manner that has been their right for some time now. So what I'm proposing that we do, especially I want to recognize many members of the committee here. I could call you by name, but maybe just recognize that there are concerns, rightfully so, about profiling, racially profiling, specifically young people in our communities. I want this hearing to be the opening of a dialogue, the bringing forth of community voices about how we could unroll this, how we could educate people that this is coming, and how we can start to unwind what has become a very volatile, very unhealthy, and very dangerous culture of carrying weapons in our city. With that, what I'd like to do now, if okay with the chair, is open it up to questions about, specifically about the legal components here of the bill, and then I'm also, of course, open to talking about how we can move forward in consideration of the bill in a way that we could consider taking a vote at some point.
Absolutely. So I guess at this point, I will open it up to questions from the committee, and I know that we have at least one alderman here who's not on the committee, and if he has any questions, I'd be happy to entertain those as well. So I'll just go down the roll. Alderman Oldenburg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Alderwoman, thanks so much for bringing this legislation forward. So walk me quickly, if you wouldn't mind, maybe through the legal thread that you're pulling on here. I mean, it feels like we're sort of, threading the needle here. So if someone's walking down the street with a semi-automatic or an assault rifle, and this is passed as an ordinance, an officer, a sworn officer of the state can engage with that individual and ask them if they have a concealed permit.
Correct.
And if they don't, what's the consequence? There's a fine?
Right now in the ordinance, we have a fine and we do have a potential for jail time. I think, and these are up for discussion, I think the most important thing that can happen is that the weapon is removed from the public at that time. We have talked about, currently there is a confiscation clause. This was brought up, I want to say, the city councilor has identified this could be a legal issue. So I'm extremely open to removing that confiscation clause. It would still not prohibit an officer from safe harboring that weapon at that moment and removing it from the public right away and the public being openly carried in the public.
I see.
So yes, in that way, currently, barring suspicion of illegal activity, the open carrying of an AR-15 is perfectly legal in the city of St. Louis, or any semi-automatic weapon. And there's no action that a police officer or anybody can take in that way. You cannot get a concealed carry permit in the state of Missouri unless you're 19. So what this would essentially do is, especially for children, which I have personally seen on numerous occasions carrying weapons in an open fashion, it would allow some action to take place at that time.
I see. So it goes without saying, this bill is certainly more than symbolic, right? It does allow an officer to engage with an individual who's carrying an assault rifle down the street and potentially safe harbor it or confiscate it. And despite that putting us in a legal quagmire or even soliciting a legal challenge, I think it's a symbol and a reality we should fight. We constantly hear from our local police department, from the mayor's office, from the public safety division, that we are a culture of guns and that Jeff City will not fix it. And that is an attributing factor to our violent crime. We constantly hear this. And this is a bold step to engage sworn officers of the state with people who are carrying rocket launchers, bazookas, AR-15s down the middle of our rights of way, the common places throughout our city. I would like to be added as a co-sponsor and look forward to working with you so that we continue to thread that needle of making this a legal ordinance in the city. I would also pose a rhetorical question to members of the committee as well as to our fellow alder people, is that despite Missouri law, put that aside for a minute, do you think it's a societal norm for somebody to walk down a street with an assault rifle, past children, past churches, past schools, past parks? Do you think that is a societal norm?
Well,
I would think everyone, it was a rhetorical question, but I know you're itching to answer it. Do you think that's a societal norm? And do you think potentially engaging, confiscating, removing, and ensuring someone is permitted could have a counter impact to violence? Somebody is much more susceptible to be trigger happy if they're holding a gun, to your point, than if it is in a holster behind their back and they're engaging with a law officer or other members of society. I don't have any other statements, but you're welcome to comment further on that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
yeah, thank you. Unfortunately, it has become commonplace here in St. Louis, and it is terrifying. I appreciate the comment that this is a bold step, but I actually think it's a pretty, it's exactly what Kansas City has in place. And so from that perspective, it's almost like, how did we not see this before? How has this been lying there in plain view and we didn't know it? I think the concept of us being preempted by state law has been so baked into our collective conscious that we didn't see this one pathway. And while I am so frustrated with the state of Missouri on guns and on failing to fund homeless services and failing to give the city of St. Louis even its due on gas tax and other infrastructure funds, they did give us this one pathway. And while I'm frustrated that the state of Missouri doesn't have a blanket ban on assault rifles and have other common sense red flag gun laws in place, I will say for this to be an ordinance does one good thing for our citizens, and that is that it doesn't criminalize the carrying of these weapons. An ordinance violation doesn't go on your record. It doesn't inhibit you from getting a job. It is just an ordinance violation, and it gives us a tool to remove the weapon from the public. And from that perspective, it has a lot of utility, and it, I think, can really help us address some of the ongoing terrifying gun violence in our communities.
Thank you for that. Alderwoman Keys.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, this is a very disturbing issue that we even have to discuss this. In my ward, regularly, I see young people walking with assault rifles. I don't know what the purpose would be. I call it legalized menacing. That nobody feels, oh, he's just walking with an AR and I'm comfortable. Nobody's comfortable with that. My residents are not comfortable with that. We're hearing gunshots every single night. Rarely does a night go by where somebody isn't shooting. Recently, we had a killing in O'Fallon Park. Where do we begin to just say enough? Enough. I don't care if you're black, brown, white, yellow, I don't care. This is not something that should be happening in a civilized society. And we have to do something. And we have to stop using the excuse. Nobody should be walking around with a high-power AR-15 Uzi. I don't care what it is. Nobody. What are you doing with it out in public, except to show maybe power that you don't have, that you want people to see you as being a powerful person because you're carrying this high-power rifle with you? It has to stop. And so that's pretty much as much as I can say about it. It breaks my heart that our young people are dying at record numbers. And we continue to have these discussions that really are not impacting us in society in a good way. We have an opportunity here, and I think that we need to take it and take full advantage of what it does have to offer us, and to help bring some civility to our communities. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Alderwoman Velazquez.
Hi. Thank you, Alderwoman Spencer, for bringing this up and bringing this to the forefront of things. I think all of us can agree, but I will tell you that gun violence is a huge problem in our city, for the community and for attracting people and beyond downtown. I'm curious if you've engaged different community groups and/or law enforcement groups to just, see their take on this approach to, tackling this issue.
Thank you for the question. So I will say on the forefront, I've engaged to some extent, chairing the Budget and Public Employees Committee. I've been really engaged, and that's why I'm not asking for a vote today. And I recognize that there's a lot more work to be done in that regard. That being said, I have engaged with several organizations of pastors, of community members in my community, and several law enforcement organizations. I don't want to speak for those folks, but I can say, broadly speaking, that there's a significant amount of support. I feel comfortable saying that the overwhelming majority of police officers that have communicated with me are very supportive. Even coming after our conversations over the last week, I've kind of gone back to some folks about some ideas to generate some ideas of how we could ensure that we're not just hoisting a volatile situation. And I can share that, slow walking this out, having an engagement campaign, is something that many officers have offered as a solution to kind of and not make this immediate, but use this as an opportunity to communicate, hey, in a month, hey, in several weeks, or hey, this is going to become law, you can do this now, but here's where we're going with this, that sort of thing. But to be honest with you, I do feel like we have a lot more work to be done on that. In a perfect world, I think what we would educate the community that this is law, and we use that as an opportunity to shift the culture, just leave these guns at home. You know, if you have to carry a weapon, have it in your backpack, have it in your pocket, have it be of a size and a caliber that fits in a concealed manner. Because as I pointed out, the difference between ending in violence, deadly violence, between a gun in a pocket and a gun in a hand is not, it's just, there's a vast difference there. So I'm hoping to shift the culture with this. And so I welcome thoughts. I'd love your partnership or thoughts on how we can make sure that we're engaging the right folks in the weeks ahead.
And specifically like violence prevention groups?
I did. I have been in communication with those folks. I asked them a couple of weeks ago if they'd be willing to host some forums. We're in discussions about what that could look like. To have conversations, and to your point and to their point, there needs to be some community conversations that will take a little bit longer than just getting this, ramming this through. So I'm here for those conversations, but they haven't started yet. Yeah, and actually, if you would be interested in helping to kind of put together a list of folks that you'd like to see engaged, I can work on that. It's certainly welcome partnership in working on that conversation.
Sure, yeah, I think I would love to do that. I think my concern is just, as I mentioned, earlier, it's, the idea of just making sure that we're not creating any other unintended consequences on communities that are already being affected by gun violence. And certainly culture change, I believe, has to happen with the community, not just for the community. So I would, I think to do that, it does require real partnership with the community.
And I really welcome your thoughts and on how to do that.
Alderwoman Sunier.
Hi, Alderwoman.
Hi.
So one, I did hear your story, and you and I have had a chance to talk about your bill outside of this. And so, I don't think there's any, probably no elected official in the city and probably nowhere in St. Louis that, wouldn't agree that guns are a problem in our issue. All over the community, because I also saw a lot of places in media where only talking about downtown, and that really bothers me, because there are certain communities that have heard gunshots since they've been in their cradles as a child, in their crib. So I think it's important when we talk about policy and legislation that we are talking about the way this is impacting all of our cities. I'm curious, have you had any communication, because you said that this was kind of from Kansas City. Have you had any communication with any Kansas City officials, and particularly anyone that is in their legislation or in their, their law enforcement?
Yes, I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth, but yes. And as I mentioned in the preamble or the front end of this conversation, in Kansas City, this law, which I actually provided you the Kansas City ordinance as well, they don't have to enforce this. Like I said, it never became legal to openly carry a firearm. It never became the norm. It is not something that they see on a regular basis, these large, long guns walking down the street. So, from their perspective, this is just a thing that it never became legal. It was never a thing. We're in a different situation here. We have to unwind years of allowing this to proliferate, and so we're just in a very different situation than they are in Kansas City. But they haven't seen any legal challenges, so I'll say that, to the ordinance that is in place there. And it's been effective just by quietly being on the books, I would say.
Okay, so I spoke with some officials in Kansas City, and also as a Board of Education member, last year we had that very tragic school shooting. So I worked, with students and some other folks, just to kind of research and see what we could do around guns for the problem that they are. To my understanding, Missouri is a constitutional carry state. Are you familiar with that? Do you know what I'm referencing?
I am familiar to some extent. Gun laws are very complicated and very complex, but yes. Yes.
Right, and so constitutional carry means that, an individual doesn't need a license or they don't need a permit to carry, to conceal carry or open carry a gun, and that is state law. That will override anything that we do. So I have a lot of questions about just the legality of it. And even when, like I said, when I kind of looked into it before and spoke to Kansas City and asked them questions about just like enforcement and why this hasn't taken place. Now, mind you, their bill was a while back and we became a constitutional carry state in 2017, but it still applies. And so to my understanding, we would not be able to do anything around open carry or concealed carry.
So I will say the gun laws in general at the federal and state level are extremely complicated, and I did not walk through this alone. While we are a constitutional carry state and we are banned from having any local legislation related to concealed weapons, this is the law and the path that we can restrict the open carrying of firearms. I did engage with our city attorney, who took a look at all these components, and she's our attorney as well. I don't want to share her words, but I did ask her for permission to just broadly state that in speaking with our city attorney, we feel confident moving forward with this bill with the exception of the confiscation clause, which I mentioned earlier. She has there's some recognition that there may be some conflict with state law in that specific provision, just the confiscation clause. So other than that, it does appear to conform to state law. That's not to say state law can't change, and that's not to say Jefferson City can't get pissed off, excuse my language, and go and change their law and remove this one pathway. But the City of Kansas City, like I said, hasn't, to my knowledge, seen any challenges to their very, very similar bill, their very, very similar ordinance, and it's been effective by simply being on the books, in my opinion, in my view.
Yeah, for me, constitutional carry from everything I've seen is not limited to just concealed carry. It applies to open carry too, which again would mean that not that I don't want to, not that I think any of us don't want to, but I just, from my understanding, Kansas City isn't enforcing it because it's not enforceable. So that's part of why they're not executing. It's not just because, well, this kept us away from the culture. It was also because, it was questions around its enforceableness, but maybe that's something as a committee that we can look into being a constitutional carry state and how that might, impact this bill, because I just don't, even the Supreme Court had a case, it went all the way up to the Supreme Court where they ruled the same thing, that, hey, you can't, this applies to open carry and concealed carry. And those are recent decisions, and I'm happy to share that with the committee. But I just think there may be more to us to it not being enforced. And then I would also I know you said, she said, so if I think a large problem with the guns in our city is because they're on the streets. So if we can't confiscate the guns, which means that the person who's caught with the gun would be able to keep the gun. So here are my thoughts. If we can't confiscate the gun, but we're going to send officers into a situation where they have to approach somebody that is already open carrying, which to me is that behavior alone is an indication of something and would put anybody on high alert and high alarm. And so now you have your officer going, and we've already said they can't take the gun. They're going to approach this person with a gun in a constitutional carry state. So we still have that legality to swim through. But now you have this interaction between this police officer and between this person, and we're going to send our officers into this kind of interaction for a fee, which I know that the bill states a fee amount, but even that, again, when I was looking into it and in the conversations I've had with city council and legal representation, they believe that the capping of the fee would have to be $35. So for a $35 citation in a city where, people don't even, people are running rampant with temp tags. But we're gonna send an officer to have an interaction with a person with a weapon already displayed for potential to give a $35 fee. like, that is alarming, and I just don't, like, I don't, and we have a lot of work to do on the bill, but I don't see a way when we're looking into the implications, because nobody else has put this into practice in our state, that just leaves so much gray area. And if we put this into practice, and we're putting both, again, in the last few years, we haven't had many instances where police have shot someone, but we have had instances. In my ward, there's 2 officers that are off duty because they were harmed by individuals. And so now this is really alarming to me, and I want us to do something. I'm one of those people that have grown up and been raised in the city and have been familiar with gun violence, and probably have lost at least 30% of, different people that I went to school with throughout the years to gun violence. But as legislators, we have a responsibility to put things in that are practical, and to think about what the enforcement will look like all the way around. And we can't get so, and we all are emotional. We're humans, we have emotions, but we can't get so emotional that we don't think through how this will play out. So what are the real consequences? What does it look like to put something like this in practice? How does racial equity and class apply to these situations? Because like we mentioned, a lot of folks with these guns are young people. They are folks who are not even in high school yet. And so they're at risk, and the officer's at risk. And again, all of this with all of these gray areas and the nuances. So I know that wasn't necessarily a question for you, but I guess my question is, have you thought about, similar to Oldenburg's question, what that interaction would look like? And even if, some of the things in the bill that outlines what the consequences are, it doesn't seem to me we can do that. We moved the confiscation clause. We can't even take the guns off the street. So they're going to get a $35 fee, but they can keep walking or go on the next block and take their gun right out. Like, I'm just not seeing how this is going to work out as far as implementation and practice of it. And I'm just making sure that I raise that up and lift that as something for us to think about.
Well, if I could, on the confiscation side of things, confiscation would mean, kind of permanently taking the gun. But what we can do is safe harbor it. We can't immediately remove it from the person who's carrying it. This is an ordinance violation, so an officer would be able to immediately take that gun, safe harbor it, and then the person involved would be able to go and get the gun at a later time, so long as they are following the law and not openly carrying it in public. So we can immediately remove it. The confiscation would just be the permanent removal of that gun from that person's possession, which we're not doing. The fines, I would personally be fine with no fines at all. Because our officers are already going into these situations that are extremely volatile all the time. And these AR-15s, they go right through bulletproof vests. They do nothing. So, nobody is safe from these weapons. They're weapons of war. They don't belong on our streets. They certainly don't belong in the hands of anybody, as far as I'm concerned, but certainly our city's children. So I think that's part of why I wanted to just have a discussion about sort of the legal aspect of it, because it is extremely complicated and it is extremely confusing. Confiscation versus safe harboring it, where an officer can remove it from the public at that moment. I also want to say, we have, again, I really appreciate your perspective on recognizing that, like, we have to do something. We have to do something. So my question would be, what is that? We can either let the state make it illegal, in which case it's a criminal offense that will go on your record. If we take this path that the state has carved out for us here locally, this is a way for us to remove a gun from a street without impacting someone's ability to have a career, go and get a job, or do other things, meaningful, impactful things with their lives. To your point about how we should be looking at this through a racial equity lens, that is something that I have not fully done. And that is the work that has to happen before this goes into effect, that I agree with you on entirely. And I hope through this, we can work together to find a path through that. I will say also on the constitutionality piece, it is confusing. I'm not a lawyer, even though I get to make laws for a living, and I'm grateful to the voters for putting me in this position to do that despite not having a law degree. So I'm leaning into our city councilor, our city attorney, and other attorneys on this issue when it comes to the constitutionality of it, because when I printed out the state statute on guns, it was a pile of papers this big, and that's just at the state level. There's also all kinds of federal laws related to this. And again, our city attorney, who works for our city, who was appointed by our mayor and works for all of us, does feel confident, does feel comfortable with this, without
but-
the confiscation clause.
I saw, you know, we're all, she works with all of us, so I saw, I saw, you know, the opinion. But again, even in that opinion, the confiscation language didn't say or safe harboring, because what the attorney was referring to was state statute that says that under no circumstances can you disarm someone with a gun unless they are committing a criminal activity or a criminal offense with a gun. I didn't see any exceptions for safe harboring. I didn't see, I mean, and the state statute very clearly says, under no circumstances can you disarm someone who has a gun unless they're committing a crime. And that was confirmed from the city councilor when I spoke with her as well, which is why she, you know, said, hey, confiscation can't fit in here, and didn't make the alternative recommendation of safe harboring.
Well, in this case, if you're openly carrying a firearm and you don't have a concealed carry permit, you are engaged in illegal activity if this were law. And so there is, you know, I mean, you're right, but you're, by definition, openly carrying a firearm without a concealed carry permit is an unlawful activity if this becomes law.
Yes, I don't, since we still have some fleshing out to do,
Yes.
I just, because of Missouri constitutional carry, which I would love to strike it down. If we had the seat to do that as well, and we're elected as judges, would love to strike it down, but that to me makes it questionable. It specifically says open carry or concealed carry, and I looked and saw other instances where it was carried out in other states, and they were like, no, everything applies, both open and carry, but you know, like I said, I appreciate you for doing this work. I think there's a lot to discuss as far as the legalities of it. Right now, I don't think that, you know, with the questions of state and whether or not we're allowed to, you know, that constitutional carry language, the language around are we able to disarm it? So what are the possible consequences? And just sending folks into that interaction, I think, you know, there's a lot more to flesh out, and I just have a lot of questions about the legality and the implementation of it. And to me, just to say that, well, Kansas City has this law, but they never had to enforce it, that we would have to enforce it because of where we are. So we do have to think about how does that happen and how can we go about that? And that is a situation that Kansas City has not been in.
You're right. I agree with you entirely. We now have to enforce it and figure out what that public campaign looks like. But I can tell you, I am not going to be bullied by the state of Missouri on gun laws. I do not take their bullshit when it comes to women's rights, LGBTQIA. The state of Missouri has tried to handcuff us on every issue. They want the city of St. Louis to fail. And a good way to make us fail is to continue to allow rampant gun violence to besiege every single neighborhood in this city. And I refuse to kowtow to Missouri's laws. And if we can find a path here, even if there's a little gray area, I am going to march right through it. Because I am so sick and tired of the guns in our communities, the murders, the gun violence, just the fear of walking down my street. You've been to my home. My son has heard gunfire since he was in the cradle every week, and I'm tired of it. And I'm not going to let the state of Missouri bully us out of the one path we have through here, even if it is a tiny bit gray. That's my position on it. And I am emotional, and it is hard to not be when it comes to an issue that is just destroying our city.
And I share your passion, and I understand your emotion 100%, and I feel emotional as well. But I also want us to be honest and look at history as a precedent. Also, as a Black person in this country, a lot of times when states and cities decide to enforce things and to come down on these laws, it is Black people and people of color and low-income folks who pay the piper. So yes, I want us to do every single thing that we possibly can about guns, but I don't want Black people or brown people or any other group of color or someone who is low-income or our officers for that matter, to be the casualties of us doing things and passing policies that have a lot of questions around legalities and implications. And again, that is our responsibilities as legislators, is we have to go do our due diligence, and we have to do our homework, and we have to make sure that we do have a city for all of us, and that when we pass policies and we do things, we make sure that they're not going to disproportionately target or cause harm on any groups of people. And again, in this case, it is not just for people of color, whatever color they may be, or class. It is also for our officers, because this people's lives are on the line. This is guns involved. So while I share that passion, I don't want any group to be a casualty of us trying to do things, or later on we're having another board meeting and we're having this conversation, but now we're having it and we're talking about an officer who has died or a person in our community who has died. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Vice Chair Aldridge.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. First off, Alderwoman Spencer, I think this is an emotional conversation to have for many layers. I appreciate your leadership on starting a conversation that has been well overdue before you've been in office, or anybody up here been in office. We've been having issues with guns even before the state of Missouri made it a law where you can basically carry a gun with no laws or no regulations or anything. I know in my neighborhood, and I know not just in my neighborhood, north of Delmar, we've been having issue with gun violence for generations now. So this is no new task. It is probably only got a little bit worse, and we still haven't figured out a way to address it with state laws making it harder for us, or with local leaders in the city of St. Louis that have not truly looked at violence and poverty, lack of opportunities invested in that way. So I do appreciate your take on trying to figure out how do we do something about firearms, because I think, like many of us, it's not one neighborhood, maybe some, I'm gonna be real, actually, yes, in some neighborhoods you hear it a lot more than some folks on this committee or some folks in this board than you do in others. I hear it on a regular basis. I've lost family members to gun violence. I think we all share the same sentiment of we have to do something, because what we also know is as the summer is approaching, as young people are out, and I just don't even want to keep focusing on young people to make it seem like they're the problem. It is people carrying guns, not being responsible with it. I have a firearm myself. I believe in the Second Amendment, but I believe in being a responsible gun owner. And I think that is the approach that you were trying to take without violating anybody's constitution, which I do appreciate that. However, I have to echo, and we do this a lot in budget, always echoing the lady from the 7. I have to echo her as well. And I'm with you. I want to kick down the doors in anything possible on the state level. That's why I ran for state rep, and I've seen that it is difficult to do in a super majority of Republicans that are getting extreme more and more each year, and I felt like I can come here and make a local impact. But some of the things that I have issue with, and I appreciate you not taking this to a vote today because I could not comfortably vote yes for it, is like the alderwoman from the 7th Ward said, is ultimately on the state law, and state law trumps local law. And the state law allows people to openly carry with a permit or without a permit. So to say that the ordinance will trump state law, I feel like will get us into some loopholes that eventually will be legally challenged. Also reading the opinion from the city councilor, from what I've read, it says we cannot confiscate. We can't take the gun, we can't harvest the gun. So a $35 fine and having a law enforcement officer interact with maybe a group of 5 folks, and we know that we're down officers. What we've seen as folks that are representative of downtown area, this has been happening over the weekend, but the reality is it's not just happening downtown. Like Alderwoman Key said, it's happening in her ward, it's happening in all our wards. But just to put an officer at risk for $35, and I know you don't want to do the ordinance, but to put an officer at risk or the other person who has the gun, who probably legally is over the age of 19, can be carrying it and don't know about this piece of legislation because they're not educated and now don't know they have to have a permit. We have historically seen, just in this city, when there's guns, and I'm gonna be real with people of color and law enforcement interaction, 80% of the time, that situation turns deadly. So my biggest fear outside of this also gives me like stop and frisk vibes, which also is unconstitutional in New York, and I think this eventually will get there, is that while we're trying to do something because we are sick and tired of being sick and tired of seeing these guns on our street, we're tired of losing family members to gun violence, that this piece of legislation does the opposite and brings more chaos on the streets in the city of St. Louis than actually trying to calm them, especially if you can't take the gun or harvest it. And we can look at that in the legal opinion, but if you can't even take it and you're just giving somebody a fine.
I'm going to disagree with that interpretation. I think confiscation is a specific legal term that while it might be viewed as unconstitutional, I think we need some definitions around safe harbor, because it is my distinct understanding that we can take the gun. We can't confiscate it. It's a different legal term, but we can take it at that moment.
And I think even if as we harvest a gun, again, and I'm not a lawyer, nor do I play one on TV, SCL TV, but even as we harvest the gun, again, with the state law saying it's an open carry state, and we're saying you have to have a permit, the gun is now harvested, and I pay my $35 fine, and I say I don't need a permit because the state says that this is a open carry state. It's just a lot of unsureness that I think we really need to be cautious about, and even to the point of what the alderwoman from the 6th Ward said, as far as making sure we reach out to folks that this would impact, even getting remarks from the chief. Did he comment, or have you talked to the chief to know if this would be helpful or harmful?
I have spoken to the chief, and I don't want to put words in his mouth or say anything publicly that he's not stating, but I know that he has stated very publicly that he is in favor of changing the gun laws and making the open carrying of firearms is not a reasonable thing. And he has expressed on numerous occasions, this is the first time he's ever worked in a city that has the open carrying of firearms as law.
So and I think his expression would be similar as all of us who want to change it, but as far as regarding your bill,
I'm not going to put words in the chief's mouth, but I will say, we have two ways of doing this, either at the state level or at the local level. If the state passes a law that we all keep pointing to and saying, why isn't the state taking action? It will become a criminal offense, and we will not have control over what happens. If we pass a local ordinance, it is not a criminal offense, and we can actually control how it is enforced. And this, to me, is a path that has some benefits to it, specifically addressing some of the concerns brought up by the committee.
I would disagree that I don't think the state will penalize it, because the last thing they want to do is make any regulations around guns. So I don't think they would penalize it. They would probably see this, especially as it's been in the media and everything, and when session starts up in January, absolutely try to repeal the section that St. Louis is causing a lot more attention to compared to Kansas City, who's also not enforcing the same ordinance, because they do have a different environment. But me and you have already talked off record and let you know that I would love to work with you to make this a legally sound piece of legislation that actually does what I think we all want to do, is get guns off the street, compared to being a stop and frisk type of piece of legislation, or legislation that not just put our police officers at risk, but people who are carrying firearms who could legally be carrying them. And someone's not going home because there's a gun involved.
Well, I appreciate that, and I would welcome your leadership and moving through that.
All right, Alderwoman Spencer, first I want to commend you for your work on this. As you stated, you know, I know from my own research that firearm laws in the state of Missouri are complex, and there's a lot of them. So you really have opened a can of worms here. But I think that you're saying and showing that you're willing to put the work in so that we come out of this with a bill that is going to be constitutional. I think we're, as a committee and as a board, we're obligated to ensure that any laws that we pass pass constitutional muster. I know from our previous discussions and discussion with the city councilor's office that we do need to get rid of the confiscation language, and as you noted, that is a legal term of art. But I do have some concerns with some of the way that you envision this working as far as the seizure. You've specifically stated that it would not be a criminal infraction, that it's an ordinance violation. But if we look down to 21.750 that you put in front of us, if we look down to section 3.2c there, in the absence of any reasonable and articulable suspicion of criminal activity, no person carrying a concealed or unconcealed firearm shall be disarmed or physically restrained by a law enforcement officer unless under arrest. So if a member of our, if a member of our police department arrests someone, they can certainly seize any firearm on them subject to arrest. But then we would certainly have to have an arrest take place. Is it your vision here that a person open carrying a long gun in violation of Board Bill 29, if it were passed, would be arrested?
I don't want to have anybody carrying a long gun in the city of St. Louis ever again. That is my vision.
Sure.
That is my only vision here. Okay?
No, and
I don't want to see another long gun anywhere in the city of St. Louis ever again. That being said, if somebody is carrying it on the streets in the general public, you know, the term criminal, I see we're going here, you know, I mean, it's not going to go on somebody's criminal record as far as it being criminalizing guns. This would be a criminal activity, but an ordinance violation. An ordinance violation is still criminal activity, but doesn't constitute a criminal record for the person involved in it. So, I mean, I don't want the Board Bill 29 or any gun bills or any bills for that matter to be my vision. You know, we're here today to hopefully open up a conversation about how this can reflect the vision of the majority of St. Louisans, and we're here to represent our own districts in that regard. That being said, I think the removal of the gun, the path to get that gun off the street at that moment is the path I'm hoping we can all agree to find a path to getting to. And what that specifically looks like, the fine, the $35 or whatever that looks like that comes after it, my goal is to just get the gun off the street. Keep it at home, keep it in your backpack, keep it in your car for that purpose, but just keep it off the street and keep it off your person.
Just for everyone out there, regardless of what Alderwoman Spencer says, do not keep your gun in your car.
If you're transporting it.
Just wanted to weigh in on that.
I just mean, don't, you know what I'm trying to say, Alderman.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, and I don't want you to think that I am coming at you on this. I'm just trying to envision what you see this laid out as, because I do anticipate someone's going to challenge this, and I think that we have an obligation to make sure that we're at least in a defensible position, that the city councilor is willing to defend this ordinance should it pass. And I do think, if the penalty clause in this does see arrest in it, then I do think that we get past that section of the state law, because then the person's subject to arrest. Absent that, I would want the city councilor to weigh in other than that. But I think it sounds like we also want to hear, the members of the committee want to hear from some of the police department to get their take on the matter, since they will be the folks tasked with walking up and introducing themselves to these folks who are carrying rifles in our city. I know from previous conversations that I've had with men and women on the police force that they're okay with this. The individuals that I've spoken with, I can't speak for the organization, that they want to see legislation to help get guns off the streets. And I've talked to them about just the ability to conduct more or less a Terry stop, which has been problematic in other places. A lot of people equate it with stop and frisk, but I don't think it's unfair if you're walking down Market Street with an AK-47. I think it's fair for a police officer to walk up to you and ask if everything's okay. Is there a reason why you have this firearm right now? There's no reason why they can't have consensual encounters with these folks right now. Of course, the individual could say that they're not interested in talking to the police officer, and that's the end of the encounter. But I think that there's still things that need to be fleshed out here. Just in general, it sounds like that's what you're intending to do. And so I certainly want to continue the work on this with you. So if you have anything else that you'd like to kind of close with.
I appreciate that. And I think, one thing I want to be clear on, that this would not empower a police officer to engage with anybody that isn't openly carrying a firearm. You have to be displaying a firearm very, very openly and obviously in order for any interaction to take place. And that is a difference. But that being said, I am one person and I have one lived experience. I want to welcome and encourage and facilitate the conversations that need to happen to bring everybody on board. So I am just, this is just an invitation, a request maybe from any member of the committee that wants to see some action on gun laws to take place, to communicate with me your specific concerns. I can try to work through them. I can try to address them. Conversations you want me to have, that you're willing to host, and any work beyond this law, whether it's a companion bill or amendments to the bill that would help to outline how we would roll this out. Do we, consideration for a public education campaign, or a way to unroll it that gives members of the community the most amount of education leading into any changes in the law related to gun carrying. I encourage folks to host their own conversations without me. Please do. Or if you would like me to join or be a part of those, I would really welcome the opportunity to continue this conversation. And I can be the keeper of information, but I don't want this to be my vision. I want this to be a vision that can move us in the direction of less guns in the public right of way, in the hands of folks, especially our kids, and less violence in our city.
Great. Well, thank you so much for bringing this, and look forward to continuing the work on it.
Thank you.
At this time, we will take up committee discussion item number 1, Prop S. You can proceed. Yeah.
So the FY '23 Prop S contracts are
I'm
nearly.
sorry, can you state your name and the department you're with?
Sure, so sorry. My name is Mo Farrell. I'm the Deputy Director for the Office of Violence Prevention with the City of St. Louis. We are managing the Prop S funding for the youth at risk. The funding is officially with the Department of Public Safety, but we've taken on kind of the management of the contracts. The FY '23 Prop S contracts are nearly all fully executed. There are 2 left with the Comptroller's Office that we're expecting, I think, within the next couple of days. So those contracts are April 1st through December 31st of this year. And we wanted to discuss the process for the moving forward after this year, because we've been in a bit of a transition period as the management has transitioned to this new Office of Violence Prevention, and there have been some hiccups along the road over the last few years.
So can we back up just a little bit? We have several new members of the Board of Aldermen here who may not have the same familiarity with Prop S as some of the longstanding members. So could you just give a brief history about what Prop S is?
Sure. I'll do, again, I'm also new to this, so
Okay.
I'm going to do my best.
I apologize.
Yeah, no, it's okay. So just for background, I started with the City of St. Louis last September, right as the Office of Violence Prevention was getting started. And so we kind of inherited this over the last few months. Prop S, I believe, was passed several years ago to allocate some $1 million of tax funding per year for youth at risk programming. It is a pot of funding that has always been kind of, I don't know if allocated is the right word, the awards are decided by this committee, and the administration of the contracts has always been the responsibility of the Department of Public Safety. And so, does that hit all the points?
Yeah, I think so. And so basically, historically, this committee has taken applications from various entities that provide crime prevention activities and consider the qualifications of the various applicants and then dole out the money. And this historically has taken place not as out in the open as I think it probably should. So I think we're going to be making it more clear why the decisions are being made and who is getting the awards, rather than it kind of being done in it's historically been done in a subcommittee here with members both on or not on the Public Safety Committee. Those hearings have not been public. They haven't been televised. There was awards that I know were aldermanic pet projects that were awarded, and so we maybe weren't seeing the awards based on the actual qualifications of the applicants. So I want to make sure that as we move forward, we're not doing it the way that it's always been done, that we are looking towards the actual quality of the applicants and keeping in mind the ultimate goal that these funds are not just to prop up an organization in anyone's ward. These funds are specifically to trying to prevent crime and to try to help rehabilitate those who have been victims of crime or witnesses to crime, particularly violent crime, so that, that cycle that we often see in our society does not continue. Unlike most years, there's also ARPA funds out there that go to after-school programming, which is important. But I think as a result of those ARPA funds, we may be wanting to look at different applicants than we historically have, since we do have a separate pot of money for funding after-school programs. So I'd like to, and this certainly won't be all my decision, this will be this committee's decision, I'd like to ensure that while we have kind of these two pots of money for the time being, that we're trying to keep the underlying goal of Prop S and what it was designed for, what it lays out, in mind as we look to allocate those funds. We're going to have to move fairly quickly with an RFP on this, a request for proposal. And I just wanted all of you to be able to ask questions or raise any concerns that you may have with this process with a member of the office, so that you feel confident as we move through this process. And this is just the beginning of a conversation. This is not, we're not going to be making decisions today. We're not going to, this is the very beginning of a process that's going to take several months. And so I anticipate that we'll be hearing more from the office, but I want to first make the introductions and then see if you have any basic questions about what the program is, the process, what needs to happen, the timeline that it needs to happen on, things of that nature. And so with that, if you're comfortable with it, I'll just open it up to the committee for any specific questions they may have. And if you don't know the answer, I don't know is totally fine. We can always address them to Mr. Pickney. So let me.
I'll just clarify that, so part of what you were mentioning in terms of wanting to explore the ARPA funding avenue for other youth programming is that came up in conversation because a lot of the same organizations have been funded year to year, and a lot of them, not a lot of them, some of them are more appropriately described as after-school programming, which is not to say that could be under the umbrella of violence prevention, but the way that this RFP is interpreted is pretty broad. It's really just says kind of youth at-risk programming, and it's not well defined what that means. So while, it's not to say that, these organizations shouldn't continue to receive funding, the question is, should the same organizations continue to receive the same types of funding? And would it be more appropriate for some of these programs to be funded through other sources, especially now that we have this $3.6 million in ARPA funding for after-school and year-round youth programming that has been untouched still?
So I will just go down we'll start with Alderwoman Keys.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The question that I had, and I heard you say after-school programming, is it exclusively?
No.
Okay. So what other programs would or have benefited from these funds in the past?
So I can tell you a little bit about what we have for this year. So there are 21 awardees for FY23. Another important note to make is that this is $1 million that has been cut between a lot of organizations. Okay. So the majority of the awardees for this fiscal year got $53,200 for the year, which for some organizations is a lot and really allows them to do programming that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do. For some other organizations, it's just supplementing some of their existing staff salaries, and they have much larger budgets. So some programs are also like summer programming. There's some sports-related programs. Pianos for People is one where they provide music lessons for students, and also some free piano donations. Some other examples off the top of my head. I don't know if you all received the list, but we do have a list of all of them with like short descriptions from the scopes of work from all
But
the
when I
contracts.
hear violence prevention, I'm looking for the meat and potatoes, so.
A lot of them are kind of interpreted as we're keeping kids off the streets by providing this other programming.
Okay. So keeping them off the streets, are there any programs that possibly directly counsels, talks to young people about personal safety, maybe even having a moral compass of some sort? So, after-school programs are great. I'm a former educator, so I get it. Kids do need some place to be, in that gap where, they get out of school, but parents aren't home yet. I get that. But I'm really kind of interested in programming.
Yeah, I think some of them do that. I couldn't tell you which organizations off the top of my head, but we did meet with each one of the awardees this year, and that type of thing I know came up with at least one organization.
Thank you.
Alderwoman Velazquez.
Thank you for being here. I had a few questions on process and timeline, but can you just, Alderman Narayan said that it's pretty quick, so can you just kind of explain, like, the RFP's not, when the RFP is out, when you make all the timeline?
Yeah, so the timeline has always been an issue from my understanding historically, and the RFP has never gotten out quite as soon as it should have been. And so we're trying to kind of map out what the process could be moving forward. And I think the one you were referring to is we're trying to decide whether to release an RFP, which would probably need to happen in June, this month, it's June 1st, in order to seek a third-party reviewer for the proposals. We would want to get ahead of that to make sure we get someone contracted to do that before or as we're writing the RFP, which would then need to be released probably by July. We're just trying to work backwards from needing to get everything approved by the end of this year for new contracts to start January 1st of 2024. So historically, they have been on a calendar year timeline.
Yeah, that's, pardon me, but part of the issue is running on a calendar year rather than the fiscal year. And so that's something that we may be looking to address as well. There's also the fact that this legislative body goes on recess during the summer, which is right when they need us to be doing things. So we need to make sure that we have this done before we recess. And I apologize for cutting you off. Please proceed.
Not at all, no. And then I guess my question is, very different conversation, but not totally unrelated to the conversation we had earlier today. When you talk about trying to change culture and people's habits and things like that, what are the metrics for success that I know. Are they defined? Are they a year? How long does it take to get a benchmark? I know that, again, these are not simple point A to point B solutions when you try and, change people's lives. But are you planning on building that in? Is that something we could do with the funds? Is there a third-party reviewer, or not third-party reviewer, but is there an organization that could help with that? And then how does that factor into, if we are talking about making long-term change in the city, how do we make sure that we're doing that and not just investing in things that don't really work?
No, that's a great question. We've asked those questions ourselves, and we unfortunately don't have a lot of metrics or data to point to from the past contracts. When we started this process with the current cohort, if you will, of organizations, we did talk to them about data collection and that we will be requiring that on a monthly basis, and are hoping to have something to point to by the end of their funding year to show how the funding what benefits we can show from this particular pot of funding. I think part of what's difficult about that is, like I was mentioning, for some of these organizations, this particular pot of funding is a drop in the bucket. And so how can we say this $53,200 really made a difference? So we're having conversations about that, and it also makes, I think if we want to say Prop S is making a particular impact in one area, it may be worth considering contracting with fewer organizations for larger sums of money.
And I guess my question is has, at least from the city's vantage point, have we done that? And I know, like, it's kind of an oxymoron, right? If you prevent crime, and how are you going to measure things that don't happen? But we're glad that didn't happen. But, but are there just things that, like, overall that you're looking at? I mean, is it, I don't want to mix apples and oranges here, but, like, there's a higher rate of, kids actually making it in school, or there, are there things that maybe not exactly a result of the program, or there are things that you're looking at like, okay, we're making things better overall?
I mean, I'd say as an office, as the Office of Violence Prevention, we are certainly looking into those types of questions and hiring staff to be able to start collecting data and analyzing it. And we're also looking at contracting with evaluators to start digging into that, all of that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'll circle back around.
Sure, that's fine.
Is that all that you had, Alderman Velazquez? Alderwoman Sunier.
I just want to, thank you for your work around this. I was on the Board of Education, and I am always just someone who thinks that, similar to what we were talking about earlier, culture doesn't change itself, and one of the best ways to change it is to invest in children and start them off early with resources and exposure to things and new concepts, and a chance to really explore themselves and get to define themselves for themselves and not necessarily the situation that they're born into. So just for people at home, I know that you all do some work with Roosevelt Community Council and are going to be giving them some money, and they're doing some great work. So part of creating villages for children who don't have them and aren't born into them, unfortunately. And then I was just looking too at a list where I saw that some money is going to go to Affinia Health. I think that's excellent because, again, when you're talking about inequities and you're talking about children, giving them resources that they need just to function mentally, physically, are so important. And then I also saw that there's some money going to the 22nd Judicial Court, to their family court, juvenile division. I think that's excellent because oftentimes when our youth do get into trouble and they go into there, they come out worse because they haven't had, actual rehabilitation services to make them better. And then I also saw STL Intersect Arts, which I think is excellent too, because a lot of our young people need a healthy outlet and need exposure to what healthy outlets are. And art is a great example, and a lot of our kids have natural gifts there. So I just wanted to share the information with the public and thank you for your work.
And Alderman Keys, you had a follow-up
Well,
question.
actually, is it seventh?
Seven.
Seventh. The Alderwoman from the 7th Ward. We're still working on getting these numbers down. Answered some of that. So in terms of the agencies, and that's really what I was asking.
I didn't realize you didn't have a list.
Yeah, and I probably wasn't as clear. So yeah, in terms of the agencies, and I'm happy to hear that some of the agencies that I've worked directly with are recipients of this money. I mean, even though, a lot of them have been doing the same work for a lot of years, we still have a very high level of violence in our communities. So, like I said, I'm happy to hear that some of those agencies will benefit.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, I don't have anything further. Do any other members of the committee have anything further? Well, thank you so much for coming today and talking to us about this, and we'll certainly be inviting you and your office back as we move through the process here.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. At this point, I will entertain a motion to excuse Alderwoman Clark Hubbard.
Second.
Motion to excuse Alderwoman Clark Hubbard.
All right, there's a motion and a second. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right, Alderwoman Clark Hubbard is excused, and I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn?
Second.
There you go.
All right, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
The Public Safety Committee is now adjourned.